The smell of expensive wine and fresh flowers filled the air at La Belle, one of the fanciest restaurants in the city. Crystal glasses sparkled under soft lighting, and the sound of quiet conversations mixed with the gentle clinking of silverware on fine china. In the corner of this elegant dining room sat a beautiful black piano. Its polished surface reflected the warm light from the chandeliers above. But this piano was just for show, nobody ever played it. The restaurant owner had made it very clear that only professional musicians hired for special events could touch those keys. Maya wiped down another table, her worn sneakers squeaking softly on the marble floor. At 24, she had been working at La Belle for almost 2 years. Every night she served wealthy customers who spent more on one meal than she made in a week. But Maya didn't mind the hard work. She needed every penny she could earn. During her breaks, Maya would often steal glances at the piano. Her fingers would move slightly as if she was playing invisible keys. Sometimes, when the restaurant was quiet between dinner rushes, she could almost hear music in her head, the same pieces she used to play years ago before life got complicated. Maya had grown up in a small apartment where her grandmother's old upright piano took up half the living room. Her grandmother, who had once been a music teacher, spent hours teaching Maya to play. Those afternoons felt like magic, just the two of them, lost in melodies that seemed to make everything else disappear. But that was before her grandmother got sick, before the medical bills piled up, before Maya had to drop out of music school and find work to help pay for everything. The piano had to be sold, along with most of their other belongings. Maya hadn't touched piano keys in over 3 years. Now, as she cleared away expensive plates and folded cloth napkins, Maya tried not to think about what her life might have been like. She focused on her work, smiled at customers, and pretended not to notice the beautiful instrument that sat silent in the corner. The evening shift was always the busiest. Rich business people came for meetings over 7-course meals. Couples celebrated anniversaries with champagne that cost more than Maya's monthly rent. Families gathered for special occasions, their laughter mixing with the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers. Maya moved between tables with practiced efficiency. She knew exactly how to be invisible when customers wanted privacy, and how to be attentive when they needed something. She had learned to read people quickly, which ones were kind, which ones were demanding, and which ones barely noticed she existed. The restaurant manager, Mr. Rodriguez, was strict but fair. He had given Maya a chance when she desperately needed work, and she was grateful for that. But he was also very clear about the rules. Staff were not to touch the piano, ever. It was worth more than any of them made in a year, and it was not a toy. As Maya refilled water glasses at a corner table, she caught herself humming softly. It was an old melody her grandmother had taught her, something classical and beautiful. She stopped quickly, hoping no one had noticed. In a place like this, even humming felt out of place. The dinner crowd was starting to thin out when Maya noticed him walk in. He was tall, maybe in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than her car. His hair was perfectly styled, and he carried himself like someone who was used to being the most important person in any room. Maya recognized him immediately. Everyone who worked at La Belle knew about him. He was one of those people whose picture appeared in business magazines. The kind of man who owned companies and made decisions that affected thousands of people. He came to the restaurant at least once a month, always demanding the best table, always expecting perfect service. Tonight, he wasn't alone. 2 other men in similar expensive suits followed him to his usual table by the window. Maya could tell from their body language that this wasn't a social dinner. This was business, and it looked serious. She watched from across the room as they ordered wine and appetizers. Their conversation seemed tense, with lots of serious looks and quiet, intense talking. Maya had learned to sense when customers were having difficult conversations, and this was definitely one of those nights. As the evening went on, Maya kept busy with her other tables. But she couldn't help noticing that the atmosphere at the business table was getting more strained. Voices were getting slightly louder, and the men were leaning forward more intensely. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't going well. The piano sat in the corner, as silent as always. Its glossy surface reflected the candlelight from nearby tables, making it look almost alive. Maya found herself looking at it more than usual tonight. Maybe because the tension in the restaurant was making her wish for something beautiful and peaceful. She didn't know it yet, But in just a few minutes, everything in her life was about to change. The piano that had been silent for so long was about to become the center of everyone's attention. And Maya, who had been invisible for so long, was about to step into a spotlight she never expected. The stage was set for something extraordinary to happen. All it would take was one moment of courage, one song, and one chance to show the world what she could do. David Hartman was not having a good evening. The tech billionaire sat at his favorite table, watching his biggest business deal of the year fall apart right in front of him. The two men across from him were supposed to be his partners in a major company merger. Instead, they were backing out at the last minute. "This is ridiculous," David muttered under his breath, adjusting his expensive watch. He had built his empire by making quick decisions and expecting others to do the same. Delays and excuses frustrated him more than anything else. The older of the two men, Mr. Chen, shook his head slowly. "David, we've been over this. The numbers just don't add up anymore. The market has changed since we first discussed this deal." His partner, Mr. Williams, nodded in agreement. "We're pulling out." "I'm sorry, but our board won't approve it now." David felt his jaw tighten. This merger was supposed to be the crown jewel of his business empire. He had spent months planning it, had his lawyers draw up contracts, and had already started planning how to announce it to the world. Now these men were walking away like it meant nothing. He looked around the restaurant, trying to control his anger. La Belle was supposed to be the perfect place for important business dinners. The atmosphere was elegant, the food was excellent, and the private corner tables were ideal for confidential conversations. But tonight nothing was going according to plan. David's eyes wandered across the dining room, taking in the other customers enjoying their meals. Rich families laughing over dessert, couples sharing wine and intimate conversations, business people like himself, hopefully having better luck than he was. Everything looked peaceful and perfect, which only made his frustration worse. That's when he noticed the waitress. She was young, probably in her 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Nothing particularly special about her appearance, but something caught his attention. While she was clearing a nearby table, she kept glancing toward the corner of the room, not at other customers or at her work, but at something else entirely. David followed her gaze and realized she was looking at the piano. The beautiful grand piano that sat in the corner like an expensive piece of furniture. He had eaten at this restaurant dozens of times and had never seen anyone play it. As far as he knew, it was just for decoration. But this waitress kept looking at it with an expression he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't just casual interest. There was something deeper there, something that looked almost like longing. Meanwhile, the conversation at his table was getting worse. Mr. Chen was explaining all the reasons why the merger wouldn't work, while Mr. Williams was already checking his phone, clearly ready to leave. David felt like he was losing control of everything. "Gentlemen," David said, his voice getting colder, "I think you're making a serious mistake. This deal could benefit all of us." Mr. Williams barely looked up from his phone. "David, we've made our decision. There's nothing more to discuss, that was it." David had had enough of being dismissed and ignored. The waitress walked past their table again, and once more, her eyes drifted toward the piano. This time David was watching carefully, and he saw something that surprised him. Her fingers moved slightly as if she was playing invisible keys. An idea formed in David's mind. Not a good idea, probably, but he was frustrated and wanted to take control of something, anything. He was used to being the most powerful person in any room, and tonight he felt completely powerless. Maybe it was time to remind everyone who was in charge. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying across the quiet restaurant. Maya turned toward him, looking surprised to be addressed directly. In her 2 years of working here, the wealthy customers rarely spoke to her beyond placing orders or asking for the check. "Yes, sir," she said politely, walking over to their table. David looked at her more carefully now. Up close, he could see that she was nervous, probably wondering if she had done something wrong. Her name tag said Maya, and she held herself with the careful posture of someone who was used to being invisible. "You keep looking at that piano," David said, gesturing toward the corner. His voice was loud enough that people at nearby tables started to pay attention. "Do you play?" Maya's eyes widened slightly. She glanced quickly toward the kitchen, as if looking for her manager. I used to, sir. But staff aren't supposed to—" "That wasn't my question," David interrupted, his tone getting sharper. The failure of his business deal had put him in a mood where he wanted to push boundaries. I asked if you could play. By now, more people in the restaurant were watching their conversation. David's voice had an edge to it that made everyone stop what they were doing. Maya looked uncomfortable, shifting from one foot to the other. Yes, sir, she said quietly. I can play. David smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who was used to getting what he wanted when he wanted it. The same smile he used in boardrooms when he was about to make a move that would surprise everyone. Then play something, he said simply. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Maya looked shocked. Mr. Chen and Mr. Williams looked confused. And everyone else in the restaurant had gone completely quiet. Even the soft jazz music playing through the speakers seemed to fade into the background. Sir, I don't think I'm allowed to, Maya started to say. I'm not interested in what you're allowed to do, David said, his voice getting louder. I'm having a terrible evening and I want to hear some music. You say you can play, so play. Maya looked around the restaurant desperately. Her manager was nowhere to be seen, probably in the kitchen dealing with the dinner rush. The other waitstaff were watching from a distance, unsure whether to help or stay out of it. David leaned back in his chair, enjoying the feeling of being in control again. After hours of being told no by his business partners, he finally had someone who couldn't say no to him. Or so he thought. Play something beautiful, he said, his voice carrying across the now silent restaurant. Or maybe you're not as talented as you think you are. It was a cruel thing to say, and David knew it. But he was angry and frustrated, and taking it out on someone who couldn't fight back felt better than admitting his business deal was falling apart. He had no idea that he was about to witness something that would change his entire perspective on power, talent, and what it really meant to be successful. The silence in the restaurant was so complete that Maya could hear her own heartbeat. Every person in the dining room was staring at her, waiting to see what she would do. The wealthy businessman's challenge hung in the air like a sword ready to fall. Maya's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. In all her time working at La Belle, she had never been put in a situation like this. Customers usually treated her like she was invisible, someone who brought food and disappeared. Now she was the center of everyone's attention, and not in a good way. She glanced around the room, hoping to see Mr. Rodriguez, her manager. But he was nowhere to be found. The other waitstaff were watching from near the kitchen door, their faces showing a mixture of sympathy and relief that they weren't in her position. She was completely on her own. I'm waiting, David said impatiently, tapping his fingers on the white tablecloth. His business partners looked uncomfortable with the scene he was creating, but they didn't try to stop him. Rich men like David were used to getting their way, and people rarely challenged them. Maya felt her hands start to shake. She knew the rules about the piano as well as anyone who worked here. Mr. Rodriguez had been very clear when she first started working. The piano was worth more than any of them made in a year. It was tuned regularly by professionals and only used for special events when the restaurant hired classical musicians. For wealthy private parties, staff were absolutely not allowed to touch it, ever. Sir, Maya said, trying to keep her voice steady, I really don't think I should. The piano is only for professional musicians, and my manager would be very upset if— Your manager isn't here right now, David interrupted coldly. I am, and I'm telling you to play something. His voice had gotten even louder, and Maya could see other customers starting to whisper to each other. Some looked annoyed that their elegant dinner was being disrupted. Others seemed curious about what would happen next. A few looked like they felt sorry for her, but none of them said anything to help. Maya's thoughts went back to her grandmother's apartment, where she had spent countless afternoons learning to play. Her grandmother had always told her that music was a gift, something that could bring joy to people and comfort during difficult times. But right now, music felt like a trap that was about to destroy her job. She needed this job, desperately. The money she made here paid for her small apartment, her car payment, and helped cover her grandmother's medical expenses. If she got fired, she didn't know what she would do. Jobs that paid as well as this one were hard to find, especially for someone without a college degree. But if she refused to play, this powerful man might make sure she got fired anyway. Rich customers like him had influence with restaurant owners. One complaint from someone like David could end her employment just as quickly as touching the forbidden piano. Please, sir, Maya tried one more time. I could lose my job if I play without permission. Could you maybe ask the manager first? David's expression grew even colder. He was not used to being questioned, especially not by someone he saw as beneath him. His failed business deal had already wounded his pride, and now a waitress was refusing to follow his simple request. "Let me make this very clear," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet restaurant. "Either you walk over to that piano and play something right now, or you can walk out of this restaurant and never come back. I know the owner of this place personally, and one word from me will make sure you're looking for a new job tomorrow anyway." The threat hit Maya like a physical blow. She could see in his eyes that he meant every word. This wasn't just a request anymore, it was an ultimatum. Play the piano and probably get fired for breaking the rules. Or refuse and definitely get fired for disrespecting an important customer. Maya looked at the piano sitting in the corner, its black surface gleaming under the soft lights. She remembered the feel of keys under her fingers, the way music could transport her to another world. She remembered her grandmother's patient voice teaching her scales and classical pieces, telling her stories about the composers who had written the music centuries ago. But she also remembered the last time she had played piano. It was at her grandmother's funeral 3 years ago. She had played her grandmother's favorite song, a beautiful piece by Chopin that always made the old woman smile. After that day, Maya had never touched piano keys again. The grief was too much, and she had convinced herself that part of her life was over. Now, standing in this fancy restaurant with everyone staring at her, Maya realized she had a choice to make. She could walk away and try to preserve the job she needed so badly. Or she could walk over to that piano and face the music, literally and figuratively. The businessman sat back in his chair, clearly enjoying the power he had over her situation. His business partners looked embarrassed but said nothing. The other restaurant customers watched like this was dinner theater they hadn't paid for. Maya closed her eyes for just a moment, trying to calm her racing heart. In that moment of darkness, she heard her grandmother's voice in her memory. "Music isn't something you do just when it's easy, child. Sometimes you have to play when it's hard, when people need to hear something beautiful in an ugly world." When Maya opened her eyes, she looked directly at David. Her hands had stopped shaking, and something in her expression had changed. She wasn't the scared waitress anymore. For the first time in 3 years, she was remembering who she used to be before life got so complicated. "All right," she said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll play." The words seemed to echo in the silent restaurant. Maya had just agreed to risk everything she had worked for, everything she needed to survive. But as she started walking toward the piano, step by slow step, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt like herself again. David smiled triumphantly, thinking he had won. He had no idea that he had just challenged someone whose musical gift was about to turn his moment of cruel power into something he would never forget. The piano waited in the corner, silent and patient, ready to help Maya reclaim a part of herself she thought was lost forever. Maya's footsteps seemed impossibly loud as she walked across the restaurant floor toward the piano. Every eye in the room followed her movement, and she could feel the weight of their attention pressing down on her shoulders. The distance between her table and the piano couldn't have been more than 30 feet, but it felt like walking across an entire football field. Her mind was racing with doubts and fears. What if she had forgotten how to play? It had been 3 years since her grandmother's funeral. 3 years since her fingers had touched piano keys. What if her hands were too stiff from carrying heavy trays and washing dishes? What if she embarrassed herself in front of all these wealthy, educated people? But with each step, something else was happening too. Memories were flooding back. Memories she had locked away because they hurt too much to remember. Her grandmother's gentle hands guiding her fingers to the right keys. The pride in the old woman's eyes when Maya mastered a difficult passage. The hours they spent together, lost in music that made everything else in the world fade away. Maya reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, her hand resting on its smooth, curved edge. The instrument was even more beautiful up close. The wood was perfectly polished, and she could see her reflection in its glossy surface. This wasn't like her grandmother's old upright piano with its chipped keys and slightly out-of-tune strings. This was a professional concert grand, the kind of instrument she had only dreamed of playing. Behind her, she could hear David tapping his fingers impatiently on the table. "Any time now," he called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. We don't have all night. Maya ignored him and gently lifted the fallboard that covered the keys. The black and white keys gleamed under the restaurant's soft lighting, perfectly clean and perfectly aligned. She had seen restaurant staff polish this piano every morning, keeping it spotless even though no one was allowed to play it. She pulled out the bench and sat down carefully, adjusting the height until it felt comfortable. The leather seat was soft and expensive, nothing like the hard wooden stool she had used at her grandmother's house. But as she positioned her hands over the keys, muscle memory began to kick in. Her fingers naturally curved into the proper position, and her back straightened into the posture her grandmother had insisted upon. Sit up straight, child. She could almost hear the old woman's voice. The music flows better through a straight spine. Maya placed her fingers gently on the keys but didn't press down yet. She closed her eyes and tried to quiet the noise in her head. The fear, the anger, the uncertainty about what would happen to her job. She needed to find the peaceful place inside herself where music lived, the place she had sealed off 3 years ago. In the silence, she became aware of her surroundings in a different way. She could hear the soft breathing of the people watching her, the subtle sounds of the restaurant, the quiet hum of the air conditioning, the distant clatter of dishes being washed in the kitchen. The city traffic outside on the street, but underneath all of that she heard something else. The memory of music, all the songs her grandmother had taught her, all the hours they had spent together discovering the beauty that lived inside those black and white keys. The music was still there, waiting for her to come back to it. Maya opened her eyes and looked down at her hands. They were the hands of a working woman now, calloused from carrying heavy trays with small cuts from broken glass and burns from hot plates. They weren't the soft hands of a music student anymore, but they were still her hands and they still remembered what to do. She thought about what song to play. It had to be something she knew perfectly, something she could play even if her technique wasn't as sharp as it used to be. It had to be something beautiful enough to justify the risk she was taking, and it had to be something that meant something to her, because if this was going to be her last moment as a waitress at La Belle, she wanted it to be honest. The choice came to her immediately. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It was the piece she had played at her grandmother's funeral, the last song she had performed before closing the piano lid on that part of her life. It was also the piece her grandmother had loved most, the one that always made the old woman close her eyes and smile peacefully. Maya had avoided this song for 3 years because it brought back too many painful memories. But now, sitting in front of a room full of strangers who were judging her, it felt like the only song that mattered. If she was going to risk everything, it might as well be for something that honored her grandmother's memory. She took a deep breath and let her fingers find their positions on the keys. The opening of the nocturne was gentle, almost hesitant, like someone walking into a moonlit garden. It was the perfect way to begin, soft enough that if her hands were too stiff, she could ease into the music gradually. Behind her, the restaurant was completely silent. Even David had stopped his impatient finger tapping. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen when this waitress finally pressed down on the keys of the forbidden piano. Maya thought one more time about her grandmother, about all the lessons and all the love that had been poured into her musical education. She thought about the woman who had sacrificed so much to give her granddaughter the gift of music, who had believed that Maya had something special inside her. Music is never really lost, child, her grandmother had said during one of their last conversations. It just waits for you to come back to it. Maya pressed down on the first key and the sound that emerged was pure and clear and perfectly in tune. The note hung in the air for just a moment before she added the next one, and then the next. The melody began to unfold, gentle and haunting and absolutely beautiful. She was no longer a waitress who might lose her job. She was no longer the scared young woman who had been put on the spot by a cruel customer. She was a musician again, and the music was flowing through her like it had never been away. The transformation had begun, not just for Maya, but for everyone listening. What had started as a moment of humiliation was becoming something else entirely. Something magical was about to happen in the dining room of La Belle, something that none of them would ever forget. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne flowed from the piano like water finding its natural path. Maya's fingers moved across the keys with a gentleness that seemed impossible after 3 years away from music. The melody was soft and dreamy, like someone humming a lullaby in the moonlight. But something extraordinary was happening in the restaurant. As the music filled the air, the normal sounds of dining began to fade away. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The clinking of silverware against plates went silent. Even the kitchen staff, who had been busy preparing orders, began to slow their movements to listen. Maya felt the familiar magic of music taking hold of her. Her hands remembered every note, every subtle timing, every gentle rise and fall of the melody. It was like riding a bicycle after years away. Her body knew what to do even when her mind had doubts. The calluses on her fingers, earned from months of carrying heavy trays, didn't interfere with her touch. If anything, they made her fingertips more sensitive to the keys. The nocturne told a story without words. It spoke of quiet nights and peaceful moments of love and loss and memories that lived in the heart. Maya had learned this piece when she was 16, practicing it for hours until her grandmother was satisfied with every delicate phrase. Now, playing it again, she could feel her grandmother's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. David, who had demanded this performance as a show of power, found himself leaning forward in his chair. He had expected to hear some amateur playing, maybe a few simple songs that would embarrass the waitress and remind everyone of their proper places in the world. Instead, what he was hearing was professional-level musicianship, played with an emotional depth that made his chest feel tight. The other customers in the restaurant were having their own reactions. An elderly woman at a corner table closed her eyes and let tears roll down her cheeks, remembering her own grandmother who used to play piano for the family. A young couple holding hands across their table felt their grip tighten, both thinking about how music could make ordinary moments feel sacred. Maya reached the first complex passage of the piece, where the melody danced between her right and left hands like a conversation between old friends. Her technique was flawless, but more than that, she was telling the story that lived inside the music. Every note had meaning, every pause had purpose. This wasn't just playing the piano. This was speaking a language that everyone could understand, even if they couldn't explain how. The restaurant's background music system had been turned off by someone in the kitchen, leaving only the pure sound of the piano filling the space. The acoustics of the dining room were perfect for it, allowing every subtle dynamic to be heard clearly. When Maya played softly, everyone leaned in to catch every note. When she let the melody soar, it seemed to lift the hearts of everyone listening. As the piece moved into its middle section, the melody became more passionate and urgent. This was the part that had always reminded Maya of her grandmother telling stories about her own youth, about dreams and hopes, and the way love could make everything else in the world seem less important. Maya's fingers moved with increasing confidence, and the music grew richer and more complex. David's business partners, Mr. Chen and Mr. Williams, had completely forgotten about their failed merger. They sat in stunned silence, watching this young woman transform their uncomfortable business dinner into something approaching a concert hall experience. The tension that had filled their conversation earlier seemed foolish now, like arguing about money while standing in front of a sunset. In the kitchen, the chefs and dishwashers had gathered near the service window to listen. The restaurant's sommelier, a man who had studied wine in France and prided himself on sophistication, found himself wiping his eyes as the music brought back memories of his childhood in Lyon. The hostess, who had been seating late customers, left them standing at the podium while she moved closer to hear better. Maya was lost in the music now, completely unaware of the effect she was having on everyone around her. Her hands moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years developing perfect technique. But it was her emotional connection to the piece that made it truly special. She wasn't just playing notes on a page, she was sharing a piece of her soul with everyone in the room. The nocturne began to build toward its emotional climax, the part where Chopin's genius showed most clearly. The melody became more intricate, weaving between the hands in a way that sounded like it was being played by multiple people. Maya's years of practice were evident in every perfectly timed note, every seamless transition between passages that would challenge even experienced pianists. But technical skill alone couldn't explain what was happening in the restaurant. There was something else at work, something that had to do with the honesty and vulnerability that Maya was pouring into the music. She was playing like someone who had nothing left to lose, someone who was giving everything she had to this one moment. The sound seemed to reach into the hearts of everyone listening and find something they had forgotten was there. For some, it was memories of loved ones who were gone. For others, it was dreams they had given up on, or moments of beauty they had been too busy to notice. The music was a reminder that life contained something more than just work and worry and the endless pursuit of success. David felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The cold, calculating part of his mind that was always thinking about profit margins and business strategies went quiet. For the first time in months, maybe years, he was simply present in a moment, listening to something beautiful without trying to figure out how to use it to his advantage. As Maya approached the final section of the piece, her playing became even more expressive. The melody returned to its gentle, dreamy quality, but now it was tinged with the wisdom that comes from having experienced both joy and sorrow. It was music that understood that life was complicated, that beautiful things were often fragile, and that moments like this one were precious because they couldn't be planned or purchased. The nocturne was building toward its conclusion, and everyone in the restaurant seemed to sense it. The silence was so complete that Maya could hear her own breathing, the soft whisper of her fingers moving across the keys, and the tiny sounds the piano made as its strings vibrated with each note. What had started as a cruel demand from an angry businessman had become something none of them had expected. The waitress, who was supposed to be humiliated, was instead revealing herself to be an artist of remarkable talent and sensitivity. The piano that had sat silent for so long was finally being used for its true purpose, to create beauty and bring people together through the universal language of music. David had been looking down at his phone, scrolling through emails and trying to pretend he wasn't affected by the music filling the restaurant. His business deal had fallen apart and he was angry and embarrassed. The last thing he wanted was to admit that some waitress was actually talented enough to impress him. But as Maya reached the most delicate passage of the nocturne, something made him look up. Maybe it was the way the music seemed to wrap around his heart and squeeze gently. Maybe it was the complete silence in the restaurant, so profound that he could hear every subtle nuance of her playing. Or maybe it was simply impossible to ignore beauty when it was this pure and honest. When David finally raised his eyes to look at Maya, he saw something that shocked him completely. This wasn't the nervous, frightened young woman who had served his table earlier. This was an artist in her element, someone who understood music at a level he hadn't expected to encounter in a fancy restaurant, or anywhere else, for that matter. Maya's hands moved across the keys with a grace that spoke of years of training and practice. Her posture was perfect, her technique was flawless, but what struck David most was the expression on her face. She was completely lost in the music, her eyes half closed, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She looked like someone who had come home after a long journey. David had been to countless symphony concerts, had season tickets to the opera, had attended exclusive performances by world-renowned musicians. He thought he knew what good music sounded like, but there was something different about this performance, something that all those professional concerts had lacked. This was music played not for applause or money or reputation, but simply for the love of playing it. As the nocturne continued, David found himself remembering things he thought he had forgotten. His own childhood piano lessons, abandoned when he decided that business school was more practical. His mother playing the same Chopin piece on their old family piano, filling their house with music on Sunday afternoons. The way music used to make him feel before he became focused only on making money and building his empire. Around the restaurant, other people were having similar moments of recognition. The elderly woman at the corner table wasn't just crying now. She was smiling through her tears, nodding slightly as if Maya was playing the soundtrack to her own memories. The young couple had stopped looking at each other and were both watching Maya with expressions of wonder. But the most dramatic change was happening at David's own table. Mr. Chen, who had been cold and businesslike all evening, was staring at Maya with his mouth slightly open. Mr. Williams had put away his phone completely and was leaning forward, completely absorbed in the performance. The tension that had filled their business discussion seemed to have evaporated, replaced by something much more human and real. David realized he was holding his breath. The passage Maya was playing now was incredibly difficult. He knew this because his mother had struggled with the same section for months before she mastered it. But Maya wasn't just playing the notes correctly. She was making them sing, making them tell a story that reached directly into the listener's heart. This was when David began to understand what he had done. He had thought he was humiliating a waitress, putting her in her place, showing everyone in the restaurant who had the power. Instead, he had accidentally given a gift to everyone present, the chance to witness something truly extraordinary. Maya moved into the final section of the piece, and David could see that she was completely transformed. The worried, anxious woman who had been afraid of losing her job was gone. In her place was someone confident and serene, someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it. The music wasn't just coming from her fingers. It was coming from somewhere much deeper, from a place where talent and passion and years of training came together to create something magical. David found himself thinking about power in a way he never had before. He had always believed that power came from money, from influence, from the ability to make other people do what you wanted them to do. But watching Maya play, he realized there was a different kind of power, the power to move people, to change how they felt, to create moments of beauty that would stay with them forever. As the nocturne approached its ending, the restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the people walking past on the street outside seemed to slow down, as if the music was reaching through the windows to touch them too. The entire world seemed to have paused to listen to this one woman playing this one song. David looked around at the faces of the other diners and saw his own amazement reflected in their expressions. Everyone in the room had been changed by what they were hearing. The businessman who had been arguing loudly with his wife earlier was now holding her hand across the table. The group of college students who had been laughing and talking throughout their meal were sitting in respectful silence. But it was David himself who was experiencing the most profound change. The anger he had felt about his failed business deal seemed petty now, irrelevant in the face of what he was witnessing. The need to control and dominate that had driven him to challenge Maya in the first place felt small and ugly compared to the generosity she was showing by sharing her gift with all of them. Maya played the final phrase of the nocturne with such tenderness that David felt something crack open inside his chest. It wasn't just the beauty of the music. It was the realization that he had been living his entire adult life focused on the wrong things. He had been chasing success and accumulating wealth and power, but he had forgotten about beauty, about the things that actually made life worth living. As the last note faded into silence, David sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break the spell that Maya had cast over the entire restaurant. He looked at her sitting at the piano, her hands still resting gently on the keys, and realized that he was in the presence of something he had thought didn't exist anymore in his world. He was in the presence of pure, honest artistry, and for the first time in years, the richest and most powerful man in the room felt humble. The silence stretched on, no one wanting to be the first to break it. Maya slowly lifted her hands from the keys and sat back slightly, as if she was returning from a faraway place. She looked around the restaurant with a kind of surprise, as if she had forgotten there were other people there. That's when David realized that everyone in the restaurant was looking at him, waiting to see what he would do next. He was the one who had started this, who had demanded that Maya play. Now everyone wanted to see how he would respond to what she had just given them. David stood up slowly, his chair scraping softly against the marble floor. The sound seemed incredibly loud after the profound quiet that had followed Maya's performance. He looked directly at her, and for the first time all evening his expression was completely genuine. Then he began to clap. The last note of the nocturne hung in the air like a perfect crystal, clear and pure and impossibly beautiful. Maya's hands remained on the keys for just a moment longer, as if she couldn't quite believe the music was over. The silence that followed was unlike anything anyone in the restaurant had ever experienced. It wasn't empty silence, but full silence pregnant with emotion and wonder. Maya sat motionless at the piano bench, her heart racing as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. For those few minutes, she had been completely transported back to her grandmother's living room, back to a time when music was the center of her world. She had forgotten about the watching customers, forgotten about the risk to her job, forgotten about everything except the conversation between her fingers and the keys. Now, as she slowly returned to the present moment, she became aware of the dozens of eyes focused on her. The restaurant was so quiet she could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic outside, even her own breathing. No one was moving. No one was speaking. It was as if the entire world had stopped to listen, and now didn't know how to start again. Maya turned slightly on the bench, looking out at the sea of faces staring back at her. What she saw there took her breath away. The elderly woman at the corner table was crying openly, but her face was radiant with joy. The young couple, who had been on what looked like a first date, were holding hands across their table, both of them with tears in their eyes. The group of business people who had been discussing spreadsheets and profit margins were sitting in stunned silence, looking like they had just witnessed a miracle. But it was David's face that shocked Maya the most. The cold, arrogant expression he had worn all evening was completely gone. Instead, he was looking at her with something that looked almost like reverence. His mouth was slightly open as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. For the first time since she had started working at LaBelle, this powerful, intimidating man looked genuinely human. Maya felt tears starting to form in her own eyes. Playing that nocturne had brought back so many memories. Her grandmother's patient voice guiding her through difficult passages. The pride in the old woman's eyes when Maya finally mastered a challenging piece. The way music had once made everything else in the world seem manageable. She had locked those memories away because they hurt too much. But now she realized that the hurt was worth it if it meant she could have this connection to beauty and meaning. The silence stretched on, and Maya began to worry that she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe the performance hadn't been as good as she thought. Maybe she had embarrassed herself in front of all these sophisticated people. Maybe David was just trying to think of the cruelest way to tell her she was fired. But then something extraordinary happened. David, still looking directly at her, slowly stood up from his chair. The scrape of chair legs against the marble floor seemed incredibly loud in the profound quiet. Maya watched nervously as he took a step toward her, wondering what he was going to say or do. Instead of speaking, David brought his hands together and began to applaud. The sound of clapping seemed to break a spell that had been cast over the entire restaurant. One by one, other people began to stand and join the applause. Mr. Chen and Mr. Williams, who had been so cold and businesslike earlier, were on their feet, clapping enthusiastically. The elderly woman was applauding through her tears, nodding at Maya as if to say yes. That was perfect. The young couple stood together, applauding with the kind of energy usually reserved for concert halls. Within moments, every single person in the restaurant was standing and applauding. The kitchen staff appeared in the service window, clapping and cheering. The hostess abandoned her post to join the ovation. Even the sommelier, who had studied in France and considered himself an expert on all forms of culture, was applauding with genuine admiration. Maya sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. She had expected anger, embarrassment, maybe even being escorted out of the building. Instead, she was receiving a standing ovation from a room full of strangers who had been moved by her music. The applause seemed to go on forever, washing over her like a warm wave of appreciation and recognition. But what moved her most wasn't just the applause. It was the expressions on people's faces. They weren't clapping politely because they felt they should. They were clapping because they had been genuinely touched by what they had heard. She could see it in their eyes, the way her music had reached something deep inside them and reminded them of what was possible when art and skill and genuine emotion came together. David, still applauding, began walking toward the piano. Maya tensed, unsure what to expect from him now. Would he thank her politely and then quietly arrange for her dismissal? Would he make some cutting comment to reassert his dominance? She had learned not to trust powerful men, especially when they seemed to be showing kindness. But as David approached, Maya saw something in his expression that she had never seen before in any customer at LaBelle. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't condescension. It was respect. Real, genuine respect for her as an artist and as a person. The applause gradually died down as people realized that David was about to speak. Maya remained seated at the piano, her hands folded in her lap, trying to prepare herself for whatever was coming next. The restaurant returned to that profound silence, but now it felt expectant rather than shocked. David stopped just a few feet from the piano bench and looked down at Maya. When he spoke, his voice was completely different from the cold, demanding tone he had used earlier. It was soft, humble, and filled with genuine emotion. "I owe you an apology," he said simply, "and I owe everyone in this room an apology for my behavior tonight." Maya blinked in surprise. This was not what she had expected at all. David continued, his voice growing stronger but no less humble. "I came here tonight angry and disappointed about a business deal that fell through. I took that anger out on you in a way that was completely inappropriate and unfair. I thought I was showing everyone who was in charge, but instead, you showed all of us what real power looks like." He paused, looking around the restaurant at all the faces still watching them. "What you just shared with us wasn't just music. It was a reminder of what matters, what's beautiful, what's worth fighting for in this world. You turned my moment of cruelty into something transcendent, and I will never forget that." Maya felt more tears sliding down her cheeks. But these weren't tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of recognition, of feeling truly seen and appreciated for who she really was underneath the waitress uniform. David wasn't finished. "I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll give me an honest answer. What's your story? How did someone with your incredible talent end up working as a waitress instead of performing on the world's greatest stages?" The question hung in the air, and Maya realized that everything was about to change. Not just her evening, not just her job, but possibly her entire life. The man who had tried to humiliate her was now asking about her dreams, and the entire restaurant was waiting to hear her answer. Maya looked up at David, still hardly able to believe the transformation she was witnessing. The arrogant businessman who had tried to humiliate her just minutes ago now stood before her with genuine curiosity and respect in his eyes. The entire restaurant remained silent, everyone wanting to hear her answer to his question. Taking a deep breath, Maya began to speak in a voice that was quiet, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I grew up with my grandmother. She was a piano teacher, and she started giving me lessons when I was 5 years old. Music was everything to us. We didn't have much money, but we had that old piano and all the beautiful music we could learn together." As Maya spoke, David moved closer and gestured to an empty chair near the piano. "May I?" he asked softly. Maya nodded, and he sat down, giving her his full attention in a way that felt completely different from his earlier demanding behavior. "My grandmother always believed I had a special gift," Maya continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared her story. "She saved every penny she could to pay for advanced lessons. When I graduated high school, I got accepted to the music conservatory. It was my dream to become a professional pianist, maybe even perform with orchestras someday." Maya paused, her hands unconsciously moving to touch the piano keys beside her. "But then my grandmother got sick. Really sick. The medical bills started piling up, and someone had to take care of her. I was all the family she had left, and she had given me everything. How could I abandon her to chase my dreams?" David felt something twist in his chest as he listened. He thought about his own family, about all the people he had pushed aside in his relentless pursuit of business success. When was the last time he had sacrificed anything for someone else? "I had to drop out of school and find work," Maya continued. "At first I thought it would just be temporary until she got better. But she never did get better, and the medical expenses never stopped coming. I sold our piano to help pay for her treatments, and I took whatever jobs I could find that paid enough to keep us going." The restaurant remained completely silent as Maya's story unfolded. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to listen. Her words painted a picture of love and sacrifice that touched everyone present. "She passed away 3 years ago," Maya said, her voice growing softer. "The last song I played for her was that nocturne. It was her favorite piece. After the funeral, I couldn't play anymore. It hurt too much to remember all those afternoons we spent together, all the dreams we had shared. So I convinced myself that part of my life was over." David found himself thinking about all the times he had complained about minor business setbacks, all the energy he had wasted being angry about deals that didn't go his way. This young woman had given up her dreams to care for someone she loved, and she had never once sounded bitter about it. "Until tonight," Maya continued, looking directly at David. "I had accepted that music was something from my past. I thought I was just a waitress now, that the girl who wanted to be a concert pianist was gone forever. But when you challenged me to play," she paused, searching for the right words. "It was like she came back to life." David stood up slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. "Maya," he said, using her name for the first time, "what if I told you it doesn't have to be over? What if there was a way to honor your grandmother's memory and your sacrifice by returning to music?" Maya looked confused. "I don't understand. I'm 24 now, I haven't had formal training in years, and I don't have money for school. What if money wasn't the issue?" David interrupted gently. "What if you could have the best teachers, the best training, All the opportunities you need to develop your talent to its full potential. Maya's eyes widened as she began to understand what he was suggesting. Sir, I can't accept charity. This wouldn't be charity, David said firmly. This would be an investment. An investment in something beautiful and meaningful, something the world needs more of. He looked around the restaurant at all the faces still watching them. Look at what you did here tonight. You took a room full of strangers and reminded them what it feels like to experience something truly transcendent. That's not charity. That's a calling. Mr. Chen, who had been listening quietly from the nearby table, suddenly spoke up. David, what about that foundation you started last year? The one for supporting young artists? David's face lit up with recognition. In all his anger about the failed business deal, he had forgotten about the arts foundation he had established, partly for tax purposes, but also because he believed in supporting talent. It had been sitting largely unused while he focused on other ventures. Of course, David said, turning back to Maya. I have a foundation specifically designed to support promising young artists who need financial backing to develop their careers. You would be perfect for it. Maya felt dizzy with the sudden turn her life was taking. But what about my job here? I need to work, I have bills. The foundation would provide a living stipend along with paying for your education, David explained. You could study full-time without worrying about money. And Maya? He paused, making sure she understood how serious he was. After hearing you play tonight, I believe you have the potential to perform on the world's greatest stages. Your grandmother's sacrifice, your years of hard work, your natural talent, they don't have to be wasted. Maya looked around the restaurant at all the people who had been moved by her music. She saw encouragement in their faces, hope in their expressions. The elderly woman gave her an encouraging nod. The young couple was holding hands and smiling at her. Even the kitchen staff was gesturing for her to accept David's offer. There's just one condition, David added with a small smile. When you do make it to Carnegie Hall or the Sydney Opera House, I want you to remember that it all started here, in this restaurant, with your grandmother's favorite nocturne. And I want you to remember that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most unexpected moments. Maya felt tears streaming down her face again. But now they were tears of joy and possibility. For the first time in 3 years, she could see a future that included music, that honored her grandmother's memory while allowing her to pursue the dreams they had shared. Yes, she whispered, and then louder. Yes, I accept. The restaurant erupted in applause again, even louder than before. People were cheering and wiping their eyes, celebrating this unexpected transformation they had all witnessed. David shook Maya's hand formally, sealing their agreement. But his smile was warmer than any business handshake she had ever seen. 6 months later, Maya was enrolled in one of the country's top music programs, studying with master teachers and preparing for her first professional recital. The program was everything she had dreamed of and more. But she never forgot the night that changed everything. True to his word, David had the restaurant install a small plaque next to the piano at La Belle. It read, "Music has the power to transform any moment and touch any heart. In memory of all the grandmothers who teach us to dream, and in honor of those brave enough to share their gifts with the world." And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the restaurant wasn't too busy, Maya would return to play that same Chopin nocturne on the piano where her new life began. The customers would stop eating to listen, just as they had that first night, reminded once again that the most beautiful surprises in life often come when we least expect them, and that true power lies not in dominating others, but in lifting them up to reach their highest potential.